The courtroom was silent, suffocated by the arrogance of one man. Brandon Mercer, the billionaire CEO of Mercer Logistics, stood tall, smoothing his Italian suit, believing he had already won. He looked at his trembling, pregnant wife Haley with nothing but contempt. He thought his high-priced lawyers and endless fortune could buy his freedom. He thought she was helpless, abandoned, and alone. But when his hand struck her cheek in a fit of rage right there in the courtroom, he didn't just break the law. He woke a sleeping dragon. He didn't look at the judge's bench closely enough. If he had, he would have realized that the woman holding the gavel wasn't just a judge. She was the mother he had banned his wife from seeing for 3 years, and she was about to rain down hell. The air in Courtroom 4B of the Supreme Court of New York was not just cold. It was sterile, stripped of empathy, and smelling faintly of floor wax and old wood. Outside, the December rain battered against the high windows, a grey backdrop to the end of a marriage that had started as a fairy tale and ended as a horror story. Brandon Mercer sat at the defense table, checking his limited edition Patek Philippe watch for the 3rd time in a minute. He tapped his fingers on the mahogany table, a rhythmic, impatient sound that echoed in the silence. To him, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a transaction, a business deal gone sour that needed to be liquidated so he could move on to the next acquisition. At 34, Brandon was the face of Mercer Logistics, a shipping empire that moved goods across 3 continents. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with slicked-back dark hair and eyes that assessed the value of everything they touched. Today, those eyes were fixed on his phone, scrolling through emails, completely ignoring the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table 10 feet away. Haley Mercer sat with her hands protective over her swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant, her petite frame almost swallowed by a maternity dress that had seen better days. Her blonde hair, once vibrant, was pulled back in a messy bun, and dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. She looked nothing like the radiant socialite who had graced the covers of Tatler 3 years ago. She looked like a ghost. "Mr. Mercer, if you could please put away your device," the bailiff said, his voice weary. Brandon didn't look up. "I'm closing a deal worth more than this building, officer. Give me 30 seconds. Haley flinched. It was that tone, that dismissal, the same tone he used when he told her she was gaining too much weight, or that her opinions on politics were cute but embarrassing. Her lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named Sarah Jenkins, who looked as exhausted as Haley felt, leaned in. "Don't let him get to you, Haley. We just need to get through the custody hearing. The judge is running late. It gives us time to review the restraining order request." "He won't let me go, Sarah," Haley whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't know him. He doesn't want the baby because he loves it. He wants the baby because it's his, like a car or a watch. The law is on our side," Sarah insisted, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. Brandon Mercer had a team of 5 lawyers behind him, sharks in pinstripes, led by Dominic Thorne. No, not Thorne. Dominic Voss, a man known as the Butcher in divorce court. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The clerk stood up. "All rise," the clerk announced. "The Honorable Judge Margaret Davis presiding." Brandon finally pocketed his phone, standing up with a languid grace, buttoning his jacket. He smirked at his lead lawyer, Voss. "Let's get this over with. I have a flight to Tokyo at 6. The judge entered. She was a woman of imposing stature, her silver-grey hair cut in a sharp bob, her face a mask of stone. Her robes billowed around her as she ascended the bench. She didn't look at the lawyers. She didn't look at the gallery. She opened the file in front of her with precise, deliberate movements. There was something terrifyingly efficient about her. "Docket number 4492, the judge said, her voice a deep, resonant alto that demanded absolute attention. "Mercer versus Mercer. Custody hearing and petition for order of protection." Brandon leaned toward Voss. "Who is this old bat I thought we paid off the clerk to get to Judge Henderson?" "Henderson called in sick this morning," Voss whispered back, looking slightly uneasy. "I don't have a file on Judge Davis. She must be a visiting justice from the appellate circuit." "Whatever." Brandon scoffed loud enough for the stenographer to glance up. "She looks like she needs a drink and a retirement home." "Mr. Mercer," Judge Davis said. She hadn't looked up from the papers, but her voice cut through the air like a whip. "You will maintain silence unless addressed." "Is that understood?" Brandon blinked. He wasn't used to being spoken to like a subordinate. He put on his charming, media-ready smile. "Apologies, Your Honor. Just anxious to resolve this matter for the sake of my fragile wife." The judge finally looked up. Her eyes were piercingly blue. For a second they rested on Brandon, cold and unreadable. Then they slid to Haley. Haley had her head down, staring at her hands. She was terrified of making eye contact with anyone. She felt the weight of Brandon's glare burning into the side of her face. "Proceed," Judge Davis said. Dominic Voss stood up, adjusting his silk tie. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Mercer, is a pillar of the community. This petition for a restraining order is frankly ridiculous, a hormonal reaction from a woman who is unfortunately suffering from severe prenatal distress. We are asking for full custody of the unborn child upon birth, citing Mrs. Mercer's mental instability." Haley gasped. "Liar," she whispered. "Mrs. Mercer has no income, no home of her own, and no family support," Voss continued smoothly. "She has been estranged from her own relatives for years. How can she possibly care for an infant? Mr. Mercer, on the other hand, can provide the best nannies, the best doctors, the best education." Sarah Jenkins stood up, her papers shaking slightly. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Mercer isolated my client from her family. He confiscated her passport, monitored her phone calls, and systematically cut her off from her parents. That is abuse, not lack of support." "Allegations," Voss countered smoothly. "Unproven." "I have the hospital records," Sarah shouted, losing her cool. "The bruised wrist from July. The fall down the stairs in September." "Accidents," Brandon interrupted, his voice smooth, oozing fake concern. "Haley is clumsy, especially with the extra weight she's carrying." Haley looked up then. Tears were streaming down her face. She looked at the judge, pleading silently. "Please see me. Please see the truth." The judge's face remained impassive. She was staring at Haley, her eyes narrowing slightly. It was a look of intense scrutiny, almost recognition, but she quickly masked it. "Counselor," Judge Davis said to Voss, "you claim the wife has no family support. Why is that?" Voss shrugged. "From what my client tells me, Mrs. Mercer was a difficult child. She ran away from home to marry Mr. Mercer. Her family washed their hands of her." "Is that true, Mrs. Mercer?" the judge asked. Her voice was softer now. Haley tried to speak, but her throat closed up. She shook her head. "No," she choked out. He told them I hated them. He sent letters in my name, telling my mother to drop dead." Brandon laughed. It was a short, cruel bark of a sound. "Your Honor, please. Now she's inventing mail fraud." My wife is hysterical." "I am not hysterical," Haley cried out, the hormones and the fear finally boiling over. She struggled to stand up, her heavy belly making it difficult. "You locked me in the penthouse for 6 months. Brandon, you told me my mother died. You told me she died of a heart attack and that it was my fault." The courtroom went deadly silent. Brandon's smile faltered. Judge Davis froze. Her hand holding a pen stopped in midair. "He told you. Your mother was dead." "Yes." Haley sobbed, collapsing back into her chair. He said she died hating me." Brandon stood up, buttoning his jacket, his face darkening with genuine anger now. The charm was evaporating. "Your Honor, I object to this theater. My wife is clearly delusional. I want a recess." "Sit down, Mr. Mercer," Judge Davis said. Her voice was terrifyingly low. "I will not," Brandon snapped. He turned toward Haley, ignoring the bench entirely. He took 2 steps toward the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Mercer, step back," the bailiff warned, moving forward. But Brandon was fast. He loomed over Haley, his presence massive and threatening. "You shut your mouth, Haley. You stop lying to these people, or I swear to God, once this baby is born, you will never see it again. I'll bury you." "Brandon, please," Haley whimpered, shrinking away. "You're pathetic," he spat. "Mr. Mercer." The judge's voice boomed, amplified by the microphone shaking the walls. Brandon spun around to face the judge, his face red with rage. "What are you going to lecture me? Do you know who I am? I pay more in taxes than you make in a decade. This woman is my property, Shipul." "Brandon, stop!" Haley cried, reaching out to grab his sleeve, to pull him back, to stop him from destroying himself in court. He reacted on instinct, a predator's instinct. He swung his hand back. Crack! The sound of his palm connecting with Haley's face was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Haley's head snapped back. She cried out, clutching her cheek, and slumped sideways in her chair. The entire courtroom froze. The stenographer gasped. The bailiff's hand went to his taser. Even Dominic Voss, the ruthless lawyer, looked horrified. Brandon stood there, breathing heavy, his hand still raised, realizing too late what he had just done in open court. But the most terrifying reaction didn't come from the bailiff. It came from the bench. For 3 seconds, no one moved. The red mark on Haley's pale cheek began to bloom instantly, a stark accusation against the grey atmosphere of the room. Then a chair scraped violently against the floor. Judge Margaret Davis didn't just stand up. She erupted from the bench. She didn't look like a judge anymore. The impartial mask was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. In its place was a fury so raw, so primal, that it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Bailiff," she roared, "restrain him, now!" The bailiff tackled Brandon just as he tried to step back. Brandon struggled, shocked. "Get off me! You can't touch me! This is assault! Cuff him!" Judge Davis commanded, pointing a finger that did not tremble. "If he resists, tase him." Brandon was slammed face first onto the defense table, his cheek pressed against the polished wood. "You're crazy. I'll have your badge. I'll buy this whole damn courthouse." Haley was sobbing, holding her face, rocking back and forth. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have upset him." Judge Davis bypassed the stairs. She swept down from the raised platform of the bench, her black robes flying behind her like the wings of an avenging angel. She didn't walk. She marched. She ignored the court reporter. She ignored the stunned lawyers. She went straight to the plaintiff's table, Sarah Jenkins. Haley's lawyer stepped back wide-eyed. "Your Honor, Margaret Davis fell to her knees, not in prayer, but to get to eye level with the weeping, pregnant woman. "Haley," the judge said. Her voice broke. It wasn't the boom of a magistrate anymore. It was the desperate cry of a mother. Haley froze. Through the tears, through the ringing in her ears from the slap, that voice cut through the fog. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years. A voice she had mourned. She slowly lowered her hand from her cheek. She looked at the woman kneeling before her in the judicial robes. She looked at the silver hair, the blue eyes that mirrored her own.
Mom?"
Haley whispered. The word was barely a breath. The courtroom gasped. Dominic Voss dropped his pen. Margaret reached out her hands, shaking, and cupped Haley's face, careful not to touch the bruising cheek. "Oh my God. Ellie. My baby." But Haley's eyes went wide, darting from the judge to Brandon, who was currently being hauled to his feet by 2 bailiffs. He said you were dead. He showed me the obituary." Margaret's head snapped toward Brandon. If looks could kill Brandon, Mercer would have disintegrated into ash right there on the courtroom floor. "He lied." Margaret hissed the venom in her voice, making the bailiffs flinch. "He returned every letter I sent marked refused. He told me you wanted nothing to do with me. He told me you had moved to Europe and didn't want me to know where." Brandon, now cuffed with his hands behind his back, was panting. He looked at the judge, then at Haley. The realization hit him like a freight train. The old bat. The visiting justice. Judge Davis. Margaret Davis. He hadn't connected the maiden name. Haley had taken his name Mercer. He had never bothered to learn her mother's first name, only referring to her as "that interfering old hag," before he cut her off. "You," Brandon stammered, his face draining of color. "You're the mother." Margaret stood up slowly. She towered over the room. She turned to face Brandon. The silence she commanded now was not out of respect for her office, but out of sheer terror of her rage. "I am the senior justice of the appellate court," Margaret said, her voice deadly calm. "I am the woman whose daughter you stole. I am the grandmother of the child you just threatened." She took a step toward him. The bailiffs tightened their grip on Brandon, but they didn't stop her. "And you," she pointed at him, "have just assaulted a protected witness in my courtroom, violated the sanctity of this tribunal, and committed domestic battery in front of officers of the court." "It was an accident," Brandon yelled, sweat beading on his forehead. "She provoked me, and this is a conflict of interest. You can't judge me. You're her mother. Mistrial, I demand a mistrial." Dominic. Voss finally found his voice. "Your Honor, my client is correct. Strictly speaking, you must recuse yourself. This is highly irregular." Margaret smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "Oh, Mr. Voss," she said softly, "I am recusing myself. Right now." She walked back to the bench, but she didn't sit. She grabbed the heavy wooden gavel. "But before I step down," she announced, her voice ringing out, "I am issuing a bench warrant for the immediate arrest of Brandon Mercer for aggravated assault, contempt of court, and witness intimidation. Bail is denied, due to flight risk." "You can't deny bail," Voss shouted. "I just did." Margaret slammed the gavel down. Bang! "Take him to holding and get a medic for Mrs. Mercer immediately." "This isn't over," Brandon screamed as the bailiffs dragged him toward the side door. He was thrashing now, losing all his composure. "I'll destroy you. I'll sue the state. I'll have your job." Margaret watched him go, her chest heaving. As the door slammed shut behind him, the energy in the room shifted. The adrenaline faded, and the mother took over. She ran back to Haley, who was now trembling uncontrollably, clutching her stomach. "Mum!" Haley gasped, clutching Margaret's robes. "The baby. I think—" Margaret looked down. A dark stain was spreading on the chair beneath Haley. Her water had broken. "Someone call an ambulance!" Margaret screamed, her judicial composure gone. "Now my daughter is going into labor." The waiting room of St. Jude's Hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and hushed whispers. It had been 4 hours since the chaos in the courtroom. Margaret sat in a plastic chair, still wearing her judicial robes, though she had taken off the collar. She looked out of place, a figure of supreme authority reduced to a worried mother wringing her hands. Next to her sat Sarah Jenkins, Haley's lawyer. Sarah held a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Is there any word?" Sarah asked gently. "The doctors are with her. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously," Margaret said, staring at the floor. "Stress-induced preeclampsia, because of that monster." Sarah sighed. "Judge Davis, Margaret, we need to talk about what happens next. Voss is already filing motions. He's going to claim you set a trap. He's going to claim judicial misconduct. He's already given a statement to the press saying you ambushed his client." Margaret looked up, her eyes hard. "Let him try. I didn't know it was Brandon Mercer on my docket until this morning. I didn't know he was the man who married my Haley. I only knew him as Brandon, the man she met at that charity gala." Margaret closed her eyes, the memories flooding back. 3 years ago. Haley had been 22, bright, full of life, finishing her degree in art history. She had met Brandon at a fundraiser. He was charming, older, impossibly rich. He swept her off her feet with private jets and diamond necklaces. Margaret had been suspicious from the start. She had seen men like Brandon in her courtroom for 30 years. Narcissists, controllers, men who viewed women as accessories. "He's too controlling." Ellie Margaret had warned her daughter over dinner one night. "He answers for you. He orders for you. He checks your phone. You just don't want me to be happy." Haley had shouted, defending him. "You judge everyone, Mom. That's your job. But you can't judge him." The wedding happened 6 months later, a lavish affair in the Hamptons. Margaret had attended smiling through gritted teeth. But slowly the silence started. First, Haley stopped coming to Sunday brunch. Then she stopped answering texts. Then the phone number was changed. Margaret had gone to their penthouse. The doorman, looking sympathetic but firm, had turned her away. "Mr. Mercer has left strict instructions, ma'am. You aren't on the list." Margaret had tried legal avenues, but Haley was an adult. Unless Haley filed a complaint, there was nothing the police could do. And then came the letter. A typed letter signed with Haley's signature, or a good forgery of it. "Mother, I am tired of your interference. Brandon and I are happy. Please stop harassing us. I do not wish to see you again. Haley." That letter had broken Margaret. She had buried herself in her work, becoming the iron judge of the appellate court, hiding her grief behind the gavel. "I thought she hated me," Margaret whispered to Sarah in the hospital waiting room. "I thought she chose him. He isolated her," Sarah said softly. "It's a classic textbook abuse tactic. Gaslighting. He probably intercepted your letters, blocked your number, and fed her lies. He made her believe she had nowhere to go. And then he hit her," Margaret said, her hands clenching into fists. "In front of me. That was his mistake, Sarah said. His arrogance blinded him. He didn't think anyone could touch him. He certainly didn't expect the judge to be his mother-in-law. Just then a doctor in blue scrubs emerged from the double doors. He looked tired. Margaret shot up. "Doctor, my daughter. She's stable," the doctor said, offering a small smile. "And so is your grandson." Margaret let out a sob she had been holding for hours. A boy. A healthy baby boy, premature but strong. He's in the NICU for observation, but he's going to be fine. Can I see her? She's asking for you, the doctor said. Margaret didn't wait. She rushed through the doors, Sarah trailing behind her. In the recovery room, Haley looked small and fragile in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors. But her eyes were open. When she saw Margaret, she tried to sit up.
Mom,
she croaked. Margaret rushed to the bedside, wrapping her arms around her daughter, careful of the IV lines. "I'm here, Ellie. I'm here. I never left. I never stopped looking." "He told me." Haley wept into her mother's robes. "He told me you died. He showed me a newspaper clipping. It looked so real." "He forged it," Margaret said, stroking Haley's hair. "He's a liar and a criminal, but he can't hurt you anymore." Haley pulled back, fear returning to her eyes. "He has so much money, Mum. He has lawyers. He said he'd take the baby. He said he'd bury me." Margaret straightened up. The tears dried instantly. The judge returned. "He thinks he has power." Margaret said, her voice dropping to a low growl. "He thinks money is power, but he forgot one thing." "What?" Haley asked. "He played his game in my arena," Margaret said fiercely. "He committed a felony on record, and I know the law better than any lawyer he can hire." Margaret turned to Sarah. "Get your notepad, counselor. We aren't just going for custody, we're going for everything. I want a forensic audit of Mercer Logistics. I want a deep dive into his offshore accounts. If he wants a war, I'll give him a war." Sarah grinned, clicking her pen. "I've been waiting to hear you say that, Your Honor." But the war was just beginning. Across town, in a high-priced holding cell, Brandon Mercer was pacing. He had just made a phone call to a man whose name was whispered in dark alleys, a man who fixed problems that lawyers couldn't. "Get me out of here," Brandon hissed into the phone, "and find out everything you can about Judge Margaret Davis. I want skeletons. I want dirt. I want her ruined before the sun comes up." The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought a blinding, intrusive glare. 24 hours after the incident in Courtroom 4B, the story had leaked. It wasn't just local news, it was national. Billionaire CEO assaults, wife in court, ran the ticker on CNN. Judge revealed as estranged mother in shocking custody brawl, read the New York Post headline. But Brandon Mercer was not a man who went down without a fight. He had money, and in New York City, money could buy a very specific kind of justice, the narrative. At 8:00 a.m., Brandon walked out of the central booking precinct. He wasn't wearing the rumpled suit he'd been arrested in. His team had brought him a fresh navy blue Tom Ford suit. He looked impeccable, save for a shadow of fatigue in his eyes. Dominic Voss stood by his side, flanked by 4 other lawyers. A sea of microphones awaited them on the precinct steps. "Mr. Mercer, did you hit her? Is it true the judge is your mother-in-law?" Voss raised a hand, silencing the crowd with a practiced glare. "My client has been the victim of a coordinated judicial ambush," Voss announced, his voice smooth as silk. "Yesterday, Judge Margaret Davis, a woman with a documented history of animosity, toward my client, failed to recuse herself from a case involving her own daughter. She baited Mr. Mercer, escalated a verbal disagreement, and then used her position to unlawfully detain a grieving husband. Brandon stepped forward. He didn't look angry. He looked broken. It was a masterclass in manipulation. "I love my wife," Brandon said, his voice trembling slightly. "Haley has been suffering from severe mental health episodes. Yesterday I was trying to stop her from hurting herself. The judge, she saw an opportunity to take revenge for a family grudge. I just want to see my son. I just want my family back." In a hospital room across the city, Haley watched the television screen, her face pale. She clutched the blanket to her chest. "He's twisting it. He's making me look crazy. Everyone will believe him." Margaret Davis stood by the window, staring out at the parking lot below. She had traded her robes for a sharp grey blazer, but her posture was rigid. "Let him talk, Haley," Margaret said, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the windowsill. "Lies run sprints, but the truth runs marathons." "But he's out," Haley whispered. "How is he out?" "You denied bail." "Emergency habeas corpus petition," Sarah Jenkins explained, looking up from her laptop in the corner of the room. She looked exhausted. "Voss went to a different judge at 3:00 a.m. He argued that because Margaret was your mother, her ruling to deny bail was biased and void. The night judge granted a $5 million bond. Brandon paid it in cash before the ink was dry." Haley began to cry again, the steady beep of the heart monitor speeding up. "He's coming for the baby. He's going to take Leo." Margaret turned around. The morning light caught the steel in her eyes. "He is not touching Leo. I have hired private security. 2 off-duty NYPD officers are outside this door. Another 2 are at the NICU entrance, and I've moved you to a VIP wing under a pseudonym." "It's not enough," Haley said, shaking her head. "You don't know what he's hiding, Mom. It's not just about control. It's about the company. He needs the baby." Margaret frowned, walking over to the bed. "What do you mean? Why does a logistics CEO need an infant for his company?" Haley swallowed hard, looking terrified to even speak the words. "Before I left, I heard him on the phone, with his CFO. They were talking about the legacy trust, something about his grandfather's will. Brandon only gets full control of the voting shares if he produces a male heir before his 35th birthday. Margaret and Sarah exchanged a look. "His 35th birthday is next month," Sarah noted, typing furiously. "If he doesn't have a son, he loses the company," Haley finished. "Or at least he loses control of the board. That's why he wouldn't let me leave. That's why he tracked my cycle. I wasn't a wife. I was an incubator for his stock options." Margaret's face darkened. "So this isn't a custody battle. It's a corporate merger." "And he's desperate," Sarah added, "which makes him dangerous." Margaret grabbed her purse. "Sarah, stay here with her. Guard this room with your life. I have to go to my office." "Mum, you can't," Haley pleaded. "You're suspended, aren't you?" "Administrative leave, pending investigation," Margaret corrected. "But I still have my keys, and I still have friends and Donalds in the district attorney's office who owe me favors. If Brandon Mercer wants to play dirty, I'm going to show him what happens when you drag a judge into the mud." Mercer Logistics was housed in a skyscraper that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a shard of black glass. On the 50th floor, Brandon Mercer paced his office, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, despite it being only 10:00 a.m. "Did you fix the judge?" Brandon barked at the man, sitting on his leather sofa. The man was Luther. He didn't look like a lawyer or a businessman. He wore a nondescript windbreaker and had a face that you would forget 5 seconds after seeing it. That was his greatest asset. Luther was a reputation manager, a euphemism for a man who destroyed lives for a living. "I've planted the seeds," Luther said, his voice raspy. "We have bots running stories on social media about Judge Davis taking bribes in 2018. We have a former clerk ready to testify that she drank in her chambers. By tomorrow morning, her credibility will be shredded. She won't be able to sign a parking ticket, let alone a custody order." "Good," Brandon muttered, downing the drink. "And the wife? More difficult. She's in the fortress. St. Jude's has tightened security. The mother is paying for it." Brandon threw the glass against the wall. It shattered amber liquid, dripping down the expensive art. "I need that boy, Luther. The board meeting is in 3 weeks. If I don't walk in there with a birth certificate and custody papers proving I have an heir, the vultures will trigger the dissolution clause. I will lose everything." "There is another way," Luther said slowly. "What if the mother is incapacitated?" Luther said, his eyes dead and cold. "If Judge Davis is removed from the equation entirely, Haley will crumble. She's weak. Without her mother, she'll come back to you just to feel safe." Brandon stopped pacing. He looked out the window at the city he felt he owned. He thought about the prison cell he had sat in yesterday. He thought about the humiliation. "Do it," Brandon whispered. "But make it look like an accident. A car crash, a robbery gone wrong. I don't care. Just get her out of my way." Meanwhile, Margaret was not acting like a victim. She was acting like a prosecutor. She sat in the back of a dimly lit diner in Queens, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. Across from her sat Detective Miller, a veteran cop who had testified in her courtroom 100 times. "You shouldn't be here, Judge," Miller said, looking nervously at the door. "Internal Affairs is watching you. Mercer's lawyers filed a complaint an hour ago, accusing you of witness tampering." "Let them file," Margaret said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. "I need you to look into something for me, Frank. Off the books." Miller hesitated, then put his hand on the envelope. "What is it?" "Mercer Logistics, specifically their shipping routes to Southeast Asia." Miller frowned. "Why?" "Because my daughter said something," Margaret replied, leaning in. "She said Brandon was obsessed with loss prevention on empty containers. Why would a CEO care about empty containers coming back into the US? Miller's eyes widened. "Smuggling. I don't know. But Brandon Mercer is desperate for cash. He's leveraging his inheritance. If the company is struggling, he might be using his ships for sea hustles. Drugs, guns, people. That's a big leap, Judge. I have a gut feeling, Frank, and my gut has sent 1,000 men to prison. Just run the manifest logs against the port authorities' weight checks. If the containers are registered as empty but weighing 2 tons, we have him." Miller sighed, tucking the envelope into his jacket. "You know, if he finds out I'm doing this, I lose my pension. If he finds out you're doing this, you lose your life." "He already tried to take my daughter's life," Margaret said, her voice like ice. "I'm already at war." As Margaret left the diner, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. Code red. "CPS is here." Margaret's heart stopped. She ran to her car. At the hospital, chaos was unfolding. 2 social workers, accompanied by police officers, and Dominic Voss were standing at the nurses' station outside the NICU. "This is a court order," Voss was shouting, waving a paper. "Emergency removal. The mother is mentally unstable and homeless. The grandmother is under investigation for corruption. The state is taking temporary custody of the infant until a hearing can be held. Haley was screaming, held back by Sarah. You can't take him. He needs me. He's breastfeeding. It's for the child's safety, ma'am, one of the social workers said robotically. Margaret burst off the elevator, breathless. Stop! Voss turned a smug smile, plastering his face. Ah, the disgraced judge. You're just in time to say goodbye to your grandson. He's going to a foster home. Or perhaps my client can be persuaded to take emergency foster placement, since he is the father. You filed a false report with CPS, Margaret accused, stepping into Voss's space. You claimed Haley was a drug addict. I saw the filing. Standard procedure to ensure child safety. Voss shrugged. Prove it's false. In court. In 6 months. The officers moved toward the NICU doors. If you cross that line, Margaret said, her voice dropping to that terrifyingly low register she used when sentencing murderers, you are violating the Fourth Amendment rights of that child, and I will make it my personal mission to ensure every single one of you is fired, sued, and indicted for kidnapping. The police officers hesitated. They knew Judge Davis. They respected her. Ma'am, the lead officer said to Voss, is the order signed by a judge? It's an administrative order from the Department of Child Services, Voss snapped. It doesn't need a judge yet. Then it's not a warrant, Margaret declared. And you are not entering this NICU. She stood in front of the double doors, arms crossed. A 60-year-old woman in a blazer standing against the weight of the system. Arrest her for obstruction, Voss yelled. Go ahead, Margaret challenged. Arrest a sitting Supreme Court justice in a hospital hallway while her daughter screams. Let's see how that looks on the 6 o'clock news. The standoff lasted for a minute that felt like an hour. The police officer looked at Voss, then at Margaret. He holstered his thumb away from his belt. We're not doing this, the officer said to Voss. Get a court order signed by a judge. A real one. Then call us. Voss turned purple. You're making a mistake. Leave, Margaret commanded. Voss straightened his tie, sneering at Haley. Enjoy the baby while you can. We'll be back with the paperwork by noon tomorrow, and then you'll never see him again. He spun on his heel and marched out. Margaret slumped against the door, her knees weak. Sarah rushed to catch her. That was close, Sarah breathed. Too close. We bought 24 hours, Margaret said, her chest heaving. We need to find the smoking gun. Tonight. Night fell over New York, heavy and suffocating. Margaret knew she couldn't go home. Her townhouse would be watched. Instead, she went to the one place Brandon wouldn't expect, the archives of the old courthouse. She had called in a favor from the night clerk. She needed to see the original incorporation papers of Mercer Logistics, which had been part of a civil suit 10 years ago. She was looking for names, partners, someone who hated Brandon as much as she did. She found it on page 402 of a dusty deposition. Silas Vance. Wait, no, Vance is on the forbidden list. Let me correct that. She found it on page 402. Arthur Penhaligon, Brandon's father's old partner. The man Brandon had forced out of the company 5 years ago to take the CEO chair. Margaret took a photo of the address listed in the file. A run-down estate in Yonkers. 2 hours later, Margaret's car crunched up the gravel driveway of a dark, overgrown house. She knocked on the door. A man opened it. He was in a wheelchair, breathing with the help of an oxygen tank. Arthur Penhaligon looked like a man waiting to die. Judge Davis, he wheezed, not looking surprised. I saw the news. You have a mean right hook, I hear, or your son-in-law does. I need your help, Arthur, Margaret said, stepping out of the rain. I have nothing. Brandon took it all, Arthur said bitterly. He didn't take your memory. Haley told me about the trust, about the need for an heir. Arthur laughed, a dry, rattling sound. The legacy trust. Yes, but that's not the real secret. Brandon isn't just worried about losing the shares. He's worried about prison. Why? Because the company is bankrupt. Judge. Arthur revealed his eyes gleaming in the dark. It has been for 2 years. Brandon bet big on cryptocurrency and bad real estate. He lost billions. To cover it up, he's been cooking the books, using the client escrow accounts to pay operating costs. It's a Ponzi scheme. If he loses control of the board, the auditors come in. If the auditors come in, he goes to federal prison for life. Margaret felt a chill. It was worse than she thought. He needs the baby to secure the voting shares, so he can block the audit. Exactly. The baby is his shield. Without the boy, he's exposed. I need proof, Margaret said. I need the real ledgers. Arthur wheeled himself back into the shadows of the hallway. I don't have them, but I know where he keeps them. Brandon is paranoid. He doesn't trust the cloud. He keeps a physical server, an air-gapped backup. Where? Not at the office. Too risky, Arthur said. He keeps it at the one place no one looks, the boathouse at his summer estate in the Hamptons. He calls it his meditation room. Margaret nodded. Thank you, Arthur. Be careful, Judge, Arthur warned as she turned to leave. Brandon knows the walls are closing in. A trapped rat bites hard. Margaret got back in her car. She pulled out her phone to call Detective Miller, but before she could dial, headlights blinded her. A black SUV blocked the driveway exit. Then another blocked the entrance behind her. Margaret locked her doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Luther stepped out of the front SUV. He held a tire iron in his hand. He tapped it gently against his palm. Margaret looked around. She was isolated. No cameras, no witnesses. Just the rain and the men Brandon had sent to silence her. She checked her signal. 1 bar. She dialed 911 and dropped the phone under the seat, leaving the line open. Crash! The passenger window shattered as the tire iron came through. Margaret screamed, covering her face as glass sprayed everywhere. A hand reached in, unlocking the door. She was dragged out into the mud. You should have recused yourself, Luther whispered, grabbing her by the lapels of her blazer. Get off me! Margaret shouted, kicking at him. She connected with his shin, but he barely flinched. Brandon sends his regards, Luther said, raising the iron. Suddenly, a siren wailed in the distance. Not police too close. It was a private alarm. Arthur Penhaligon had triggered his home security panic system. Floodlights from the house bathed the driveway in blinding white light. Get out of here, Arthur's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. The police are already on the line, Luther cursed. He looked at the house, then at Margaret. He shoved her hard into the mud. This isn't over. The men scrambled back into their SUVs and peeled away tires spinning in the gravel just as blue and red lights appeared at the end of the street. Margaret lay in the mud, gasping for air, rain mixing with the blood from a cut on her forehead. She was bruised. She was terrified. But as she pushed herself up, her hand closed around a piece of glass. She squeezed it until it cut her skin. They had made a mistake. They had let her live. And now Judge Davis was done with the law. She was going to burn Brandon Mercer to the ground. She crawled back to her car, found her phone, and cancelled the 911 call. She didn't want the police taking a report. She didn't want to be in a hospital bed. She dialed Sarah. Sarah. Margaret said, her voice shaking but resolute. Get Haley and the baby ready to move. We're leaving the hospital. Where are we going? We're going to the Hamptons, Margaret said, starting her engine. The windshield was shattered, the wind howling through the cabin. I'm going to get the Red Book, and I'm going to end this. The Hamptons in winter was a ghost town. The mansions stood silent behind iron gates, their pools covered their windows dark. The Atlantic Ocean roared against the shoreline, a chaotic symphony of wind and crashing waves that masked the sound of the approaching sedan. Margaret parked the battered car a mile down the road from the Mercer estate. She turned to Detective Miller, who sat in the passenger seat, checking his service weapon. "You don't have to do this, Frank," Margaret said, wincing as she touched the bandage on her forehead. "This is breaking and entering. If we get caught, your badge is gone." "If we don't do this," Miller replied, pulling a woolen cap over his head, "a psychopath gets away with fraud and attempted murder. I'm close to retirement anyway, Judge. Let's go catch a bad guy." They moved through the darkness, skirting the perimeter of the estate. The main house was dark, but the boathouse, situated at the edge of the private dock, had a single security light blinking above the door. "Arthur said the server is in the floor safe," Margaret whispered, the cold wind biting through her coat. "Under the rug in the main lounge." Miller disabled the electronic lock with a bypass tool he hadn't used since his days in narcotics. The door clicked open. They slipped inside. The boathouse was more luxurious than most people's homes. Teak floors, leather furniture, and the smell of expensive cedar. Margaret moved quickly to the center of the room, throwing aside a Persian rug. There it was, a floor safe. "It needs a combination," Miller hissed, shining his flashlight. "And a thumbprint." Margaret's heart sank. Arthur didn't mention a biometric scanner. "He didn't know," a voice boomed from the shadows. Margaret and Miller spun around. Brandon Mercer sat in a high-backed armchair in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness. He leaned forward, and the light from the security bulb outside caught the glint of a gun in his hand. "You really are persistent, Margaret," Brandon said, his voice calm, terrifyingly conversational. "I knew Arthur would talk. The old fool never could keep a secret. That's why I left the gate unlocked. I wanted you to come." Miller moved his hand toward his holster. "Don't," Brandon warned, raising his pistol. "I have 3 security guards outside with rifles pointed at this shack. You draw, you die, and the judge dies with you." Margaret stepped in front of Miller. "This ends now, Brandon. We know about the Ponzi scheme. We know about the fake accounts. Knowledge is useless without proof." Brandon smiled, standing up. He tapped the safe with his foot. "And the proof is right here. But you'll never open it. And in about 10 minutes, this boathouse is going to catch fire. A tragic electrical accident. 2 intruders caught in the blaze." "You're insane," Margaret spat. "You'd kill your wife's mother. I'd kill anyone who tries to take my company." Brandon snarled, the mask of civility finally slipping. "Do you know how hard I worked for this? I built this empire while you were judging petty thieves. I deserve this." "You built nothing," Margaret shouted, her voice filling the room. "You stole it. You stole it from your partners, you stole it from your investors, and you tried to steal my daughter's life to secure it." Brandon laughed, a hollow sound. Haley is weak. She was always going to be a stepping stone, a brood mare for the heir. Once the boy was born, she was going to have a mental breakdown, a permanent one. Margaret felt a cold rage settle in her stomach. It wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. "You underestimated her," Margaret said softly. And you underestimated me. I underestimated nothing. I have the gun. I have the money. I have the power. Do you? Margaret asked. She reached into her pocket. Brandon flinched, aiming the gun at her chest. Hands where I can see them. Margaret slowly pulled out her phone. The screen was glowing. What is that? Brandon demanded. A live stream, Margaret said, turning the screen around. Brandon froze. On the screen, the interface for a cloud broadcast was active. The view count was climbing by the thousands. I didn't just come here to steal a hard drive, Brandon, Margaret said, her voice steady. I came here to get a confession. I knew you were arrogant. I knew if I cornered you, you'd brag. You just admitted to fraud conspiracy to commit murder and arson. Live. To the internet. Brandon's face went white. He stared at the phone as if it were a bomb. No, that's not. Give me that. He lunged forward. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the small space. Margaret didn't fall. Brandon screamed, dropping his gun, clutching his shoulder. Detective Miller stood there, smoke rising from his barrel. He had drawn and fired in a split second. Police! Miller shouted. Get on the ground, now! The door burst open. But it wasn't Brandon's security guards. It was the SWAT team. Federal agents! Voices screamed. Down, down! Margaret stood amidst the chaos, the wind rushing in through the open door. She watched as they tackled Brandon, shoving his face into the teak floor he had paid for with stolen money. She walked over to him. He looked up, blood seeping through his fingers, his eyes wide with shock. You set me up, he wheezed. Margaret looked down at him, the judge once more. Court is adjourned, Mr. Mercer. 3 months later. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters, but with the public. The mother judge story had captivated the nation. The video of Brandon Mercer's confession in the boathouse had been viewed 50 million times. Haley Mercer sat in the front row. She looked different. The dark circles were gone. Her blonde hair was bright and clean. She held a baby in her arms. Leo, now a chubby, alert 3-month-old, looking around with curious blue eyes. All rise. Judge Margaret Davis walked out. But she wasn't on the bench. She was in the gallery, sitting next to her daughter. The presiding judge, a stern man named Judge Williams, took his seat. In the matter of the people versus Brandon Mercer, Judge Williams began. On the counts of grand larceny securities, fraud, aggravated assault, and attempted murder, the jury has reached a verdict. Brandon stood at the defense table. He looked gaunt. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. Dominic Voss wasn't there. He had been disbarred 2 weeks ago for his role in the false CPS report. Brandon was represented by a public defender. Guilty, the foreman read, on all counts. A cheer erupted from the back of the courtroom. Judge Williams banged his gavel. Order! Order in the court. When silence returned, Judge Williams looked at Brandon. Mr. Mercer, your crimes were driven by a level of greed and malice that shocks the conscience. You didn't just break the law. You attempted to destroy the lives of your wife and child to cover your tracks. I am sentencing you to 25 years to life in a maximum security federal facility, without possibility of parole for the first 20 years. Brandon slumped into his chair, head in his hands. It was over. The billionaire was bankrupt. The predator was caged. But the hearing wasn't over. Regarding the custody of the minor child, Leo Mercer, the judge continued, Full legal and physical custody is awarded to the mother Haley Mercer. All parental rights of the father are hereby terminated. Haley let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a year. She looked down at Leo and kissed his forehead. "You're safe," she whispered. "We're free." As the bailiffs led Brandon away in handcuffs, he stopped. He looked at Haley. He looked at Margaret. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a hollow defeat. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to apologize. Margaret simply turned her back on him. She put her arm around her daughter. "Let's go home, Ellie," Margaret said. Spring had come to New York. The grey slush of winter was gone, replaced by blooming tulips and soft sunlight. Margaret sat on a park bench in Central Park, watching Haley push a stroller along the path. Haley was laughing, talking to a young woman, Sarah Jenkins, who was no longer just her lawyer, but her partner in a new venture. "You really think we can do it?" Haley asked, stopping the stroller. "Absolutely," Sarah said, handing her a coffee. "The Mercer Foundation is dissolved. We're renaming it the Phoenix Trust, a non-profit dedicated to helping victims of financial abuse and domestic violence. You have the platform, Haley. You have the story." Haley looked at the skyline. "I spent so long being afraid, being small. I don't want anyone else to feel that way." Margaret walked over, joining them. She had retired from the bench officially last week. She wanted to spend her time being a grandmother, not a judge. "How is he?" Margaret asked, peeking into the stroller. "Sleeping like a baby?" Haley smiled. She looked at her mother. The fear that used to live in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet resilience. "Mum," Haley said suddenly. "Yes, sweetie. Thank you for standing up, for coming back for me." Margaret took Haley's hand. "I never really left, Ellie. A mother's love doesn't recognize gavels or restraining orders or time. It just waits." Haley squeezed her hand. I know that now." They walked together down the path, the 3 generations, the judge who fought the law, the mother who survived the storm, and the son who would grow up knowing only love. The nightmare was over. The real story, their life was just beginning. This story of Haley and Judge Margaret serves as a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about money or status. It's about the unbreakable bond of family. Brandon Mercer thought his wealth made him untouchable, but he forgot that the law and a mother's love are forces of nature that cannot be bought. We hope this story moved you and reminded you to stand up for those you love, no matter the odds. Justice may be blind, but it sees the truth eventually. If you enjoyed this dramatic retelling and want to see more stories where karma strikes back and justice prevails,